Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to share and subscribe the channel. The cabin door creaked open as Nolan Porter stamped snow from his boots. Another day of ranger patrols in the endless pine forests of northern Montana had left him bone-tired and frostbitten. He flicked on the lights, already dreaming of the whiskey waiting for him on the shelf, when he froze mid-step. Someone was sitting on his threadbare couch. She turned slowly to face him, and Nolan's breath caught in his throat. Her skin had a distinct blue-violet hue that seemed to shimmer slightly in the cabin's dim light. Her eyes were larger than human proportions, with irises that gleamed like polished obsidian. Her hair fell in silvery waves past her shoulders, contrasting with the dark green flannel shirt she wore, his shirt. "Who the hell are you?" Nolan's hand instinctively moved toward the holster at his hip. "And what are you doing in my cabin?" The woman didn't flinch at his threatening gesture. Instead, she regarded him with an expression of calm assessment. "My designation is Thessa. I require shelter and proximity." Her voice had an unusual cadence, each word precisely formed. "That doesn't answer my question." Nolan drew his weapon but kept it pointed at the floor. "What are you doing in my home?" "I cannot sleep alone," she said simply. "The isolation is painful. Your dwelling was the only one within range after my craft malfunctioned." Nolan's mind raced. An alien, an actual extraterrestrial being, sitting in his living room wearing his clothes. He'd heard rumors, of course. Everyone had. Strange lights in the sky, government denials that convinced no one. But to have one here, in his cabin? "You broke into my home because you can't sleep alone." Nolan kept his voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "I should call someone." "That would be unwise." Thessa stood slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate. "My presence here is not authorized. Those who would come for me would not distinguish between us in their response." The threat was subtle but clear. Nolan tightened his grip on his weapon. "So I'm supposed to just let you stay here? Because you asked nicely?" Thessa's head tilted slightly. "I did not ask. I stated a need. My species cannot sustain extended periods without proximity to another sentient being. The neurological damage becomes severe after 3 cycles without contact." "That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem," Nolan replied, but curiosity was already edging past his caution. "How'd you even find this place?" "I'm 20 miles from the nearest town." "Your electrical signature was distinct against the forest background." Thessa gestured to the window. "I have been observing for 2 days. You live alone. You have adequate space. You possess no companion animals that might react adversely to my presence." Nolan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. "You've been watching me." "Assessing compatibility," she corrected. "I cannot survive extended isolation, and not all humans would be suitable." "And I am." Nolan finally holstered his weapon, recognizing the absurdity of the standoff. "You maintain distance from others of your kind. You understand solitude." Thessa's eyes never left his. "And yet, you speak to yourself when alone. You seek connection even in isolation." Heat rose in Nolan's face. The thought of being observed in his private moments made his skin crawl. "That's invasive as hell." "Necessity often is." Thessa moved toward the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd already explored the space. "I require only proximity during rest cycles. During waking periods, I can maintain sufficient distance to avoid discomfort." "Wait," Nolan followed her, still processing the situation. "You're saying you just need to be near someone while you sleep? That's it?" "Physical proximity is essential. My species evolved as collective consciousness nodes. Isolation disrupts neural pathways." She turned to face him. "I do not intend harm." Nolan ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling heavily. "This is insane. You know that, right? I should be calling someone, anyone. You won't, Thessa stated with certainty. You are curious. And you understand what it means to be different. Those words struck uncomfortably close to home. Nolan had chosen this isolated posting for reasons he preferred not to examine too closely. The Forest Service had been happy to place him in this remote cabin, patrolling boundaries few people ever crossed. One night, he finally said, surprising himself. You can stay one night. But you sleep on the couch, and tomorrow we figure out something else. Thessa nodded once. Acceptable terms. Later that night, Nolan lay awake in his bed, listening for any sound from the living room. The cabin was small enough that he could hear Thessa's breathing, slightly faster than human rhythm, with an unusual cadence. She hadn't moved from the couch since he'd left her there 3 hours ago. Sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, questions multiplied behind his eyelids. Where had she come from? What did she really want? And most troubling of all, why had he agreed to let her stay? Just before dawn, he heard her move. Soft footsteps approached his bedroom door, pausing just outside. Nolan tensed, hands sliding beneath his pillow where he'd placed his hunting knife. Your sleep is disturbed, Thessa's voice came through the door. Your breathing patterns indicate distress. I'm fine, he responded gruffly. You are lying, she replied. But that is a human trait I understand. Tomorrow will bring clarity. Her footsteps retreated, and Nolan stared at the ceiling until morning light filtered through the window. When he finally emerged from his bedroom, Thessa sat in the same position as the night before, perfectly still, watching the sunrise through the frosted glass. You never slept, he accused. No, she admitted. Proximity helps, but trust is required for true rest. Her gaze met his. Neither of us has that yet. And in that moment, despite everything, Nolan felt the first spark of something unexpected, a connection to this strange being that transcended the barriers of species and origin. It was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. Let's start with breakfast, he said finally. Then you can tell me exactly what you're running from. The morning light cast long shadows across the wooden floor as Nolan moved about the kitchen. He could feel Thessa's eyes tracking his every movement while he prepared a simple breakfast of eggs and toast. Her presence was unsettling, not just because she was clearly not human, but because of how attentively she observed him. Do you eat? He asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. I can process your food for energy, Thessa replied, approaching the counter with measured steps. Though the efficiency is lower than with my traditional sustenance. Nolan slid a plate toward her. Which is what, exactly? Synthesized protein compounds with specific mineral concentrations. She picked up the fork awkwardly, as if unfamiliar with the tool. My kind evolved to absorb nutrients through shared communal meals. Eating alone is inefficient. Everything with you comes back to not being alone, doesn't it? Nolan leaned against the counter, watching as she tentatively tasted the eggs. Thessa's expression remained neutral as she considered the food. Isolation is antithetical to our existence. Our neural pathways require the subtle electromagnetic feedback of other conscious beings. She took another bite. Your species evolved differently, prizing individuality, separation. Not all of us, Nolan murmured, thinking of the family he'd left behind years ago. A moment of silence passed between them as they ate. Nolan noticed that despite her alien physiology, there was something graceful about Thessa's movements, deliberate but fluid, as if she were constantly calculating the most efficient path through space. You said you'd tell me what you're running from, Nolan finally said, setting his empty plate in the sink. I've kept my end of the bargain. You're still here. Thessa placed her fork down carefully. I am a research specialist from what you would call Kepler 442b. My vessel was part of an authorized observation mission studying Earth's biosphere. You're a scientist. An analyst of biological complexity and adaptive systems. She met his eyes directly. My team was recalled when a faction within our oversight council deemed human consciousness too unpredictable for continued peaceful observation. And you disagreed, Nolan surmised. I refused extraction. Thessa's voice remained even, but Nolan detected a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening around her shoulders. The decision to terminate study was based on flawed assessments of human potential. My continued research could prove otherwise. Nolan crossed his arms. So you're what, a rogue alien scientist conducting unauthorized human research? I am seeking truth, she corrected. But my defiance has consequences. Those tasked with retrieval will not discriminate between us if they trace my location. The implication hung heavy in the air. You've put me in danger just by being here. Yes. Her honesty was unsettling. Though my vessel's damage was not fabricated. I crashed 17 kilometers from here 3 days ago. The tracking systems were damaged, but repair drones will eventually locate the wreckage. Nolan ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. Great. So not only am I harboring an alien fugitive, but there's a countdown until more of your kind show up looking for you. Approximately 7 Earth days before recovery protocols would initiate secondary tracking methods. Thessa stood, moving toward the window to gaze out at the snow-covered forest. I understand if you wish me to leave. And go where? Nolan asked, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. You said yourself you can't survive alone for long. I would manage. Something in her tone made Nolan pause. Despite her composed exterior, there was a vulnerability in her words that resonated with him. He'd been managing his own isolation for years, and he recognized the toll it took. Show me, he said suddenly. Thessa turned. Show you what? What happens when you're alone too long? You said it causes damage. Show me. Thessa hesitated, then slowly rolled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt that she wore. Along her forearm, faint lines of darker blue pulsed beneath her skin like circuitry. As Nolan watched, the patterns shifted, some fading while others intensified. Neural decay begins at the extremities, she explained. The patterns you see are autonomic systems attempting to compensate for missing external inputs. Nolan stepped closer, fascinated despite himself. Does it hurt? Pain is an inadequate descriptor. Thessa's eyes met his. Imagine your consciousness gradually fragmenting, pieces of yourself becoming inaccessible. Memory, identity, purpose, all slowly dissolving into static. The raw vulnerability in her description struck something deep within Nolan. He was no stranger to isolation, had chosen it, even, but the thought of it becoming physically destructive was disturbing. What about now? He asked. Being near me, does it help? Yes. Thessa rolled her sleeve down. Human consciousness emits patterns different from my species, but your proximity provides sufficient input to slow deterioration. An uncomfortable thought occurred to Nolan. Is that why you chose me? Because I live alone, away from others who might notice you? Partially, she admitted. But also because you exhibit patterns of someone who understands isolation without being consumed by it. You have adapted to solitude without losing your essential nature. Nolan wasn't sure if he should be flattered or unsettled by her assessment. I need to make my patrol rounds, he said, glancing at his watch. The Forest Service expects regular check-ins. You fear I will compromise your dwelling while you are absent. Wouldn't you, in my position? A hint of what might have been amusement crossed Thessa's features. I have already examined everything of significance in your dwelling during previous observation periods. Nolan sighed. That's not reassuring. Honesty rarely provides reassurance, she replied. But it is necessary for trust. After a moment's consideration, Nolan retrieved his heavy winter coat from its hook by the door. I'll be back in 4 hours. Don't answer the door or phone if anyone comes by. As you wish. Thessa settled back onto the couch, folding her hands in her lap. I will be here when you return. Throughout his patrol, Nolan couldn't shake the strange reality that had befallen him. Every radio check-in felt like a lie of omission. Every set of tracks in the snow made him wonder if they belonged to whatever was hunting Thessa. When he returned to the cabin as dusk was falling, he half expected her to be gone. Instead, he found her exactly where he'd left her, though she'd arranged his collection of old nature guides in a semicircle on the coffee table. Classification systems help me understand, she explained, noticing his questioning look. Your species categorizes life differently than mine. That night, as a fresh snowstorm howled outside the cabin windows, Nolan made up the small guest room for Thessa. He watched from the doorway as she examined the blankets with careful hands. Will this be close enough? He asked. For whatever your biology needs. Thessa nodded. This proximity is adequate. Thank you for your accommodation. As Nolan turned to leave, her voice stopped him. Nolan Porter, she said, using his full name for the first time. I want you to understand something. He paused, waiting. I could have sought shelter elsewhere. There were other dwellings, other humans. I chose yours because I sensed a resonance, a similar frequency of solitude. Her dark eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him. We are both isolated by choice, yet neither of us is truly content with that choice. Nolan felt stripped bare by her perception, uncomfortable with how accurately she had read him. Without responding, he closed the door and retreated to his own room, where sleep eluded him for the second night in a row. In the darkness, he realized that Thessa's presence had already begun to change something fundamental in the careful isolation he'd built around himself. The question was whether that change would prove to be his salvation or his undoing. 3 days passed with Thessa and Nolan establishing an uneasy rhythm in the small cabin. The initial tension had given way to a cautious coexistence, punctuated by increasingly complex conversations about their respective worlds. Nolan found himself revealing more than he intended each time they spoke, drawn out by Thessa's direct questions and unfiltered observations. On the fourth morning, Nolan woke to find Thessa standing at the kitchen window, her posture rigid as she stared into the forest. Something wrong? He asked, reaching for the coffee pot. There was a disturbance in the northwestern quadrant approximately 1 hour ago, she replied without turning. An energy signature consistent with retrieval technology. Nolan set the coffee pot down. You mean your people found your crashed ship? Not yet, but they are scanning the region systematically. Thessa finally turned to face him. Their protocols would prioritize recovering the vessel before advancing the search for biological signatures. How much time does that give us? The question hung in the air between them. Nolan hadn't consciously shifted to thinking in terms of us, but the word had slipped out naturally. Thessa's slight head tilt suggested she'd noticed the change too. 2 days, perhaps 3. Her hands moved restlessly, a rare sign of agitation from her usually composed demeanor. The vessel's data core contains my research, detailed observations about human consciousness that my oversight council deemed too dangerous. Dangerous how? Nolan poured coffee for himself, then, after a moment's hesitation, a cup for her as well. She'd developed a fondness for the bitter drink, claiming it produced interesting neural responses. Thessa accepted the cup with a slight nod of thanks. My research indicates that human consciousness possesses unusual adaptive properties. While my species evolved toward collective neural harmony, yours developed in the opposite direction, individual minds capable of radical, unpredictable thought patterns. And that scares your people. Fear is an imprecise term. The Council views unpredictability as inherently threatening to stable systems. She sipped the coffee. My research suggested otherwise, that this chaotic potential is precisely what makes humans valuable as galactic neighbors. Nolan leaned against the counter. So you became the alien equivalent of a whistleblower. A faint smile crossed Thessa's face. An apt comparison. Except the consequences extend beyond professional disgrace. Those who defy council directives are subject to neural recalibration. That sounds ominous. It is the erasure of individuality, she said quietly. All that I am would be reintegrated into the collective consensus. The weight of her situation settled on Nolan. Whatever he'd thought about Thessa initially, it was clear now that she had risked everything for a principle, the belief that her people were wrong about humanity. The parallel to his own life choices wasn't lost on him. We need to retrieve your research before they do, he said, surprising himself with the determination in his voice. Thessa's eyes widened slightly. You would assist me? I'm not letting them erase you because you stood up for us. Nolan drained his coffee. Besides, if they're scanning the area, it's just a matter of time before they detect you here anyway. For the first time since her arrival, Thessa initiated physical contact, placing her hand lightly on his forearm. The touch sent an unexpected sensation through him, not unpleasant, but intense, like a mild electric current. What was that? He asked, startled. Neural resonance, she explained, withdrawing her hand. My species communicates complex emotional states through direct contact. I apologize for the intrusion. It's okay, Nolan said, finding that he meant it. What were you trying to communicate? Gratitude. Trust. She hesitated. Connection. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Nolan couldn't quite name. Later that day, they prepared to venture into the forest. Nolan gathered supplies while Thessa drew a detailed map showing the vessel's location in relation to the cabin. The precision of her spatial memory was remarkable, she recalled landmarks and distances with perfect clarity. Your neural patterns have changed since my arrival, Thessa observed as Nolan packed his emergency gear. What do you mean? The frequency of your thoughts, they've become more ordered, more focused. She traced a pattern on the table with her fingertip. Humans typically maintain chaotic thought patterns, but proximity between our species appears to create a harmonizing effect. Nolan paused in his preparations. You can read my thoughts. Not the content, only the patterns, like hearing music without discerning the lyrics. Thessa's head tilted. Does this disturb you? Strangely, it didn't. 3 days ago, he would have found the idea invasive, but now it seemed almost natural. I guess I'm getting used to having you around. As they trekked through the snow-covered forest, Nolan realized it was true. Thessa's presence had shifted from intrusion to something he was beginning to value. Her observations about Earth were insightful, often highlighting aspects of nature he'd overlooked despite years as a ranger. The interconnectedness of your forest systems resembles our neural networks, she commented as they navigated between towering pines. Individual organisms functioning as components of a larger intelligence. I never thought of it that way, Nolan admitted, helping her across a fallen log. But I guess that's why I chose this life. Everything here makes sense in a way people never did. Yet you speak to the trees when you believe no one hears, Thessa said. You seek connection even in solitude. Nolan felt heat rise to his face. You weren't supposed to know about that. It is not something requiring shame, she replied. My species cannot exist without connection. You choose isolation yet still reach outward, it shows remarkable resilience. They hiked in companionable silence until midday, when Thessa suddenly froze, raising her hand in warning. Detection drones, she whispered, pointing to the sky. Nolan followed her gaze but saw nothing until a faint shimmer moved against the clouds, a distortion rather than a solid object, like heat rising from summer asphalt. How many? 3, moving in standard search formation. Thessa pulled him toward a dense thicket of evergreens. They are programmed to identify non-terrestrial biological signatures. They crouched beneath the branches, Nolan's heart pounding as the distortions passed overhead. Thessa pressed close to his side, her breathing synchronized with his own. They did not detect us, she said after several minutes. But they will return on programmed intervals. How close are we to your ship? Approximately 2 kilometers northeast. She pointed through the trees. But approaching directly would expose us to additional security measures. Nolan considered their options. There's an old mining tunnel that runs beneath this part of the forest. It might get us closer without being detected from above. The entrance to the tunnel was half collapsed, hidden behind a waterfall now frozen into a crystalline curtain. Nolan broke through the ice carefully, revealing the dark passage beyond. The structural integrity is questionable, Thessa observed as they entered the tunnel, illuminated only by Nolan's flashlight. "Welcome to Earth engineering," he replied with a wry smile. "Not everything here is built to last." They moved slowly through the winding passage, the air growing colder and damper the deeper they went. Thessa moved with surprising confidence in the darkness, her eyes reflecting the flashlight beam like a nocturnal animal's. "Your species adapted for low-light conditions," Nolan noted. "Our home world orbits a red dwarf star. Our visual spectrum is shifted toward infrared wavelengths." She guided him around a fallen support beam. "I see thermal patterns your eyes cannot detect. Useful talent for avoiding search parties. And for understanding others." Her voice softened. "Your thermal patterns reveal much about your emotional states, far more than your words." Nolan wasn't sure how to respond to that. The thought that she could essentially see through his carefully maintained composure was both unsettling and oddly freeing. The tunnel eventually opened into a natural cavern where they stopped to rest. Sitting side by side on a fallen beam, Thessa suddenly reached for Nolan's hand. "May I?" she asked. Hesitantly, he nodded. When their fingers intertwined, the same electric sensation returned, but this time he didn't pull away. Images and impressions washed over him, not distinct thoughts, but feelings, curiosity, determination, and something deeper that felt like wonder. "That's how you communicate?" he asked when she finally released his hand. "One aspect of it," she confirmed. "Words are imprecise instruments. Direct neural exchange is clearer." "It's intimate," Nolan observed. "Yes." Thessa's eyes held his. "In sharing neural patterns, there can be no deception. It is why my species values collective harmony above individual desires. But you chose to break from that harmony. Because some truths cannot be denied, even for harmony's sake." Her gaze was steady. "Your species understands this better than mine. The value of standing apart when necessary." In that moment, Nolan understood with perfect clarity why Thessa had risked everything for her research. It wasn't just academic curiosity, she genuinely believed in humanity's worth, saw something in their chaotic individualism that her people had lost in their pursuit of perfect unity. As they prepared to continue their journey toward her crashed vessel, Nolan realized that in helping Thessa, he wasn't just protecting her, he was defending the principle she stood for, that sometimes, the lone voice speaking against consensus might be the one most worth hearing. The crashed vessel lay in a small clearing, partially buried beneath snow and fallen pine branches. It wasn't the flying saucer of human myth but rather a sleek, ovoid pod barely large enough for a single occupant. Its surface had a dull metallic sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "The damage is more extensive than I anticipated," Thessa said as they approached cautiously, her voice tight with concern. "The retrieval team will have detected the power fluctuations by now." Nolan scanned the surrounding forest, alert for any sign of the detection drones they'd spotted earlier. "How do we get your research data?" "The neural interface is still functional." Thessa knelt beside the craft, placing her palm against an unmarked section of the hull. The metal rippled in response to her touch, flowing aside to reveal an opening. "I need to extract the memory core physically. The transmission systems are compromised." As Thessa reached inside the vessel, Nolan kept watch, rifle ready. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, no birds called, no small animals rustled through the underbrush. The silence pressed against his ears, a warning as clear as any alarm. "We're being watched," he whispered, pivoting slowly to survey the tree line. Thessa didn't look up from her work. "Yes. Perimeter sentries deployed from the recovery ship." They are assessing our threat level before engagement. And what threat level are we? Nolan asked, finger resting beside the trigger of his rifle. Currently non-hostile but unpredictable. Her hands worked with precision inside the ship's console. They will not initiate conflict unless we attempt to leave with the core. Nolan's jaw tightened. Which is exactly what we're doing. Yes. Thessa finally withdrew her hand, holding a crystalline object roughly the size of a playing card. Its surface shimmered with iridescent patterns that shifted like oil on water. This contains everything, my research, my observations, the evidence that humanity deserves understanding rather than isolation. Time to go, Nolan urged, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. They had taken only 3 steps when the air before them distorted. The camouflage field dropped, revealing 3 figures that seemed almost human but not quite, taller, more angular, with the same blue-violet skin tone as Thessa. They wore fitted garments that appeared to be part of their bodies rather than separate clothing, and their expressions were identical masks of detached assessment. Researcher Thessa, the central figure spoke, its voice a harmonic blend of tones. Your unauthorized absence has been logged. The extraction protocol is activated. Thessa stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Nolan. I refuse extraction. My research conclusions stand. Your neural patterns show contamination, another figure observed, its head tilting in a motion eerily similar to Thessa's. Prolonged exposure to isolated consciousness has compromised your objectivity. Not compromised, enhanced, Thessa countered. I have experienced what our theoretical models only suggested. Human consciousness contains evolutionary potential our species has sacrificed for stability. The third figure extended its hand. Surrender the research core for evaluation by the Council. Nolan raised his rifle, though he doubted its effectiveness against beings who could traverse interstellar space. She doesn't have to surrender anything. All 3 figures turned their attention to him, their obsidian eyes unreadable. The human subject displays typical territorial aggression, the first one noted. This validates the Council's concerns. No, Thessa said firmly. He displays protection of individual autonomy, a principle our ancestors understood before the Great Convergence. A subtle shift passed through the 3 figures, a ripple of communication Nolan couldn't perceive but could sense, like the pressure change before a storm. You propose that human unpredictability is not a threat but an evolutionary advantage, the central figure stated. This contradicts centuries of established consensus. Consensus is not truth, Thessa replied. It is merely agreement. Truth exists independent of our acceptance. Nolan watched the exchange with growing tension, aware that whatever decision these beings reached would determine not just Thessa's fate but potentially how her species would interact with humanity in the future. I've seen what she's talking about, he interjected, lowering his weapon slightly. In the forest, everything exists in balance, but that balance isn't static. It's constantly shifting, adapting. The strongest ecosystems aren't the most stable ones, they're the ones that can change when they need to. The retrieval team regarded him with identical expressions of analytical interest. The human uses natural metaphors to comprehend complex systems, one observed. Primitive but not inaccurate. Listen to him, Thessa urged. This is what my research demonstrates. Human thought patterns create connections our linear consensus cannot anticipate. It is not a flaw but an alternative evolutionary path. You have formed a neural bond with this human, the central figure stated, its tone shifting subtly. This exceeds research parameters. Thessa didn't deny it. The bond formed naturally, further evidence that our species are complementary rather than incompatible. Nolan felt exposed under their scrutiny, as if they could see through his skin to the tangle of emotions he'd developed toward Thessa, confusion, admiration, protectiveness, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. Demonstrate, the third figure commanded suddenly. Thessa turned to Nolan, eyes questioning. They request proof of our neural compatibility. A direct interface would be most convincing. Like what you showed me in the cave. Nolan asked. More complete. A full neural resonance. Her expression was solemn. It would reveal everything, your thoughts, memories, emotions. Nothing would remain hidden. Nolan hesitated. The idea of such complete exposure was terrifying. He'd spent years building walls, creating distance between himself and others. Now he was being asked to not only lower those walls but obliterate them entirely. Will it hurt? He asked quietly. No, Thessa replied. But it cannot be undone. What is shared remains shared. Nolan looked at the three waiting figures, then back to Thessa. In her eyes, he saw not just determination but something that mirrored his own growing feelings, a connection that transcended the strange circumstances of their meeting. Do it, he said. Thessa placed both hands on either side of his face. The contact was gentle but the effect immediate and overwhelming. Nolan gasped as his consciousness seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of his skull, merging with another presence that was distinctly Thessa yet fundamentally different from human thought. Images flashed through his mind, Thessa's homeworld with its crimson skies and floating crystal cities, the collective harmony of thousands of minds working in seamless coordination, her growing doubts about her species' rejection of individuality, her fascination with Earth's chaotic beauty, and finally, her growing attachment to him, not just as a research subject but as a being whose solitary nature complemented her collective one. In turn, he knew she was experiencing his memories, the family tragedy that had driven him to isolation, the peace he'd found in the forest's rhythms, his growing trust in her despite his initial fear, and his realization that her presence had begun filling an emptiness he'd denied for too long. When the connection finally broke, Nolan staggered slightly, overwhelmed by the experience. Thessa steadied him, her hand on his arm sending aftershocks of neural feedback between them. The three figures had drawn closer, their expressions showing the first hint of emotion, something akin to wonder. Unexpected synchronicity, the central figure stated. The neural patterns achieve harmony despite fundamental differences. As my research concluded, Thessa said. Our species need not fear human consciousness. We can learn from its adaptability without sacrificing our collective wisdom. A long silence followed as the three communicated in their imperceptible way. Finally, the central figure spoke again. The retrieval mission parameters are amended. Researcher Thessa will return to present findings directly to the Council. It turned its obsidian gaze to Nolan. The human subject has demonstrated sufficient neural complexity to warrant continued observation. Nolan tensed. She's not your prisoner. No, Thessa agreed, placing a calming hand on his arm. But I must return to ensure my research influences our policy toward Earth. The alternative is continued isolation between our worlds. The realization that she would leave struck Nolan with unexpected force. In just a few days, her presence had become something he relied upon, a connection he hadn't known he needed. When? He asked, his voice rougher than intended. Immediately, one of the figures replied. The Council awaits. Thessa turned to Nolan, her eyes conveying what words could not. The neural bond remains even across distance, she said softly. What we have shared cannot be severed by physical separation. Will you come back? He didn't care that the others heard the vulnerability in his question. If the Council accepts my findings, I will return as official liaison to human consciousness studies. Her lips curved in a slight smile. And if they reject them, I will return anyway. The retrieval team moved toward the tree line where their ship presumably waited. Thessa lingered a moment longer, then pressed something into Nolan's hand, a small crystalline fragment broken from the research core. So you don't have to sleep alone, she whispered. It contains a neural impression, enough to maintain the connection until I return. Before Nolan could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture that sent one final wave of emotions between them, promise, determination, and something very like human affection. Then she was gone, following the retrieval team into the forest. Nolan stood alone in the clearing, the crystal fragment warm against his palm, its surface pulsing gently in rhythm with his heartbeat. That night, in his cabin that now felt too empty, Nolan placed the crystal beside his bed. As he drifted toward sleep, he felt the faintest whisper of a familiar consciousness brushing against his own, distant but unmistakable, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed incompatible. In the darkness, he smiled. Whatever came next, the isolation he had so carefully constructed around himself had been permanently breached. And for the first time in years, he welcomed the intrusion. In the vast expanse between stars, two species had begun to understand each other through the most unlikely of connections, an alien who couldn't sleep alone, and a human who had forgotten how to be anything but alone. Together, they had created something neither world had anticipated, a harmony born from difference rather than similarity, and a bond that transcended the boundaries of consciousness itself.